Majestic mountains, in the middle of a clearing, two men are standing with a shovel and a flag in their hands. It has a black and white pattern on it. One of them was named Kim Soo Ho. At the feet of the men stood cute little creatures saying short phrases. Oh no, here the man's name is Baron Frontera. Baron swings a shovel, aiming at the spot. The shovel is firmly embedded in the ground from Frontera's confident movement. A large blue digital grid spreads across the lawn from the point of impact. It is so large that it reaches the foot of distant mountains. This is the story of an ordinary civil engineer. Particles from the grid are transformed into a digital model of a metropolis. This engineer has completely changed the world. All those present watched this fascinating process. Roy turned to his assistant Gabriel, excitedly telling him that it was all money. Roy laughed out loud, which led Gabriel to believe that he was now crazy. A few years ago, when the city was at dusk, Roy received a message congratulating him on being chosen by the Absolute and having the right to make a wish. The man was lying with his head on the table and noticed the message. It went on to say that he had become one of the heroes of the novel The Steel Knight. Roy was surprised because it was the same novel he had read yesterday. The message ended with wishes of inspiration and good luck. The man is puzzled because he's not even drunk enough to dream about it. Could this be an out-of-body transference, which is so common in web novels? Is he really in another world now? Roy was lying on the ground in the suburbs, but why did he wake up from falling to the ground? He sat up and felt a strong cold chill on his body. His face twisted in confusion as he wondered what was happening to his mouth. The message was about a change in condition, namely a curvature of the mouth as a result of sleeping outside. Roy had already realized this and was getting annoyed by the messages. He realized that he had inhabited the body of the novel's hero. But who did he become in the Knight of Steel? A man who lives in a village and sleeps on the road. Suddenly someone called him master. He was approached by a man in a suit who had been looking for him for a long time. Roy noticed that he had a sword hanging from his belt. The moon was shining on the stranger's light hair. He said that he would be better off returning to the estate. The stranger turned out to be the protagonist of The Steel Knight, Gabriel Azrahan. Roy was sweating because he looked exactly like the pictures in his novel, and also because of his name. As the story progressed, Gabriel became the most famous swordsman on the entire continent. But at the beginning of the novel, he is just a knight who guarded Baron Frontera, and also the name of Baron Frontera's eldest son. Did he really mean to say that he was the same prankster, Roy Frontera? The men stood opposite each other, and Roy did not hold back his discontent. Gabriel denied it, even though he said his name, but did not say that he was a prankster. But it's good that he's judging himself correctly. Message: Gabriel looks pleased, and this makes Roy even more angry. In the middle of the forest there is a wealthy mansion, and it's evening. Gabriel lights the fireplace and tries to find out why Roy was lying on the road. After all, the day before he had been drinking since lunch and broke all the dishes in the inn. And then he got homesick and fell asleep on the road. As expected on a prankster's day. The Baron began to worry and sent Gabriel to fetch him. However, even if his son was a prankster, the Baron would feel bad if he was gone. Roy sat on the bed wrapped in a blanket and remembered that there was no heating. Gabriel recommended that he rest, and he would report to the Baron in the morning. When the servant was leaving, Roy turned to him. With a smile he asked if there was much light in their house. He was surprised by these strange words and left the room. Roy sat on the bed and watched Gabriel slam the door. Roy tilted his head in thought, because he knew the whole story. After all, he read the last chapter lying in his narrow room. Therefore, he knows what fate awaits the swarm. At the very beginning of the novel, the Baron and his wife came across vile robbers. In an instant, they lost all their wealth and decided to commit suicide, holding each other's hands. Meanwhile, the swarm begins to beg and drink alcohol incessantly, thus repeating the fate of his parents. The man was annoyed by the fact that although they were aristocrats, their lives were as insignificant as in Korea. Was it the Absolute or someone else who was up to something? He received a message that he had been chosen by the Absolute and had the opportunity to make a wish. But why did he put a man in this body? The next day the weather in the city was beautifully clear. The sun was shining through the windows of the Fronter's mansion. In the hallway, a worried mother of a swarm named Manhwa Frontera was walking with Gabriel. The mother wanted to know what had happened at the inn yesterday. But Roy denied it because he had been reading a novel that evening. The mother asked her husband to go and apologize. Roy immediately agreed to take responsibility for what he had done because it was his body for which he was responsible. Reports that the mother and Gabriel are surprised by this reaction. The sun was at its zenith. An old man standing in the street was barely loading hay into a cart. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to the men passing by nearby. Gabriel and Roy were walking casually down the street. Roy also noticed the loader, who for some reason suddenly hid behind the cart. The men were puzzled by this reaction. As they continued walking, they noticed that all the passers-by were trying to run away from them. Freud was very concerned about this. A little boy looked out of the window of one of the houses. His father suddenly grabbed him and told him not to look at him. The man immediately closed the window. Roy received a message that the villagers hated him, and he realized it himself. But why was Gabriel following him? The servant refuted that he had to guard him and keep an eye on him so that what happened yesterday would not happen again. But not to protect him, but to protect the residents from him. After all, the swarm is kind of a scoundrel. Moving on, the man thought about the fact that he needed to clean up his image so that he would not go hungry in the future, or at least somehow to deal with the family debt. Then, as the heir to the village owner, he could live in prosperity for the rest of his life. Looking at the messenger, Roy tried to find some kind of cheat and found out what functions it had. He received a message about Roy's skills, namely, being a naughty and drunk. After all, he knows how to make others nervous and become a dog after drinking. Roy was very annoyed by this and started waving his arms as he walked forward. Gabriel called the owner and asked where he was going. After all, the inn was here, and was what he wanted to apologize for a lie. Roy replied that he was just thinking. Gabriel looked into the owner's eyes with a serious look. He stood there, not understanding anything. The servant sighed and asked to enter the inn. Roy cautiously opened the door and looked inside. At that moment Gabriel realized that something was wrong with him. It was as if he had become a different person. There were pieces of broken wooden furniture on the floor of the tavern. There was a crack on the wall with a bull skull hanging next to it. Roy sat down on a chair and told the owner that he wanted to apologize to him for his mischief. There was a report that the owner of the inn was on alert, but the owner asked the host to stop with a trembling voice. Or maybe he was even more frightened because such a lowlife as Roy spoke with respect. Then he decided to change his tactics and speak a little rudely. Although this is an improper manner of a person who apologizes. However, the innkeeper said that everything was fine and he did not have to apologize. Roy was embarrassed by this answer. White clouds slowly floated across the sky. Walking along the road, Roy noticed that even after apologizing, the owner's face did not look good. Gabriel agreed with him. After all the dishes and furniture that he had broken were purchased with hard-earned money that should have been compensated. Roy was angry because he was already in debt and could not even look good in the eyes of the tenants. If he didn't pay off his debts, nothing would happen. But how? Gabriel added that due to the cold winter, the health of the innkeeper's mother deteriorated, and Roy also made a mess. Roy recalled that it was cold in the tractor, and one fireplace could not cope with such a building. It will be difficult for old people to survive in such cold weather until a floor heating system is invented. Suddenly, the swarm stopped in his tracks. His face showed that he was concentrating. An image of a light bulb appeared in his mind. It was as if a current was passed through it and it lit up. Then the man felt something. Something came to his mind. The light bulb began to emit bright electric discharges. In the owner's eyes was a previously unknown realization of something. And then an idea came to him. The light bulb emitted extremely strong electric discharges. They turned into green particles that flew in different directions, forming complex structures of blocks. Royd realized that there were no underfloor heating systems here. And if you create one in this world, it will definitely sell. For the foolish Baron Frontera, this was not even a dream. But for the real Soo Ho, who was in Royd's body, it was possible. After all, he was a civil engineer, and while in the army, he tried to build a house on his own. Day and night, he worked hard on construction sites. That's right. This is exactly how he would pay off all the debts of the Baron's family. Royd was full of enthusiasm. He turned around and told Gabriel that they were going back to the inn to get the first order. The man received a message about the beginning of his real journey. And he also received points called RP for relationships with others, which are currently 0. Royd thought about what he read in the messages. He thought that it was some kind of experience, even though nothing was explained to him. A new message came that he would be able to get RP by improving his relationship with the main characters. Suddenly, the rogue noticed that a blue sign appeared above Gabriel's head. It indicated the level of interest in the swarm was -30. Most likely this is a low level. The man turned to the servant with a smile. He wanted to increase the interest by complimenting the servant. But this reduced Gabriel's interest in him by 1 point. Having been defeated, the man decided to postpone the matter for later so that it would not get worse. A sign for a beer tavern. Royd carefully filled out the contract, naming the innkeeper as the customer and himself as the contractor. He also specified that all construction costs would be deducted from the amount of compensation for the damage. Royd held out his pen for the owner to sign, even though he didn't believe him. He was not satisfied with this problem of distrust. He couldn't ruin his grand plan from the start. He did not want to use this method. So he decided to talk like a jerk. Royd said that they should trust each other because they would see each other here often. And it worked. The tractor driver immediately signed the contract, even though it was a real rag. Nevertheless, the first contract was signed. Royd was pleased with his plan and assured the owner that he would not regret it. There were white fluffy clouds in the sky. Going out into the yard, Royd shared with the servant that there was no need to make precise calculations, since his plan was not perfect. Gabriel turned to the owner. He called the signing of the contract through blackmail a new level of arbitrariness. Royd gave the servant a suspicious look. Royd assumed that Gabriel did not think logically at all, and was not familiar with the concept of cognitive distortion, which meant that if it was like this in the past, it will be like this in the future. This occurs because brain cells contain bad thoughts and stereotypes. Gabriel rephrased it as experience and statistics. But experience and statistics are all in the past, aren't they? Gabriel didn't understand what was happening. Had he ever been so clear before? The servant looked at his master, who said they would smile. Both the innkeeper and his mother would laugh with joy. Royd began to dig with his shovel. He believed that this smile would be the foundation of his livelihood. He dug, carried, tamped, and repeated everything over and over again, while the servant silently watched. He took lumber from a warehouse on the estate and built a central wooden frame as a foundation. This was a traditional Asian method of building from dense wood. Then he applied river clay, and the hull was ready. Royd lay exhausted on the ground, chastising the weakness of his body. Gabriel was surprised at the speed of construction in 3 stages, even though a week had already passed. He seriously wondered where Royd had learned to build. Had Baron Frontera really decided to honor the agreement? The owner stood bent over in pain in front of the new building, but there was no time to rest. Completely exhausted, he still had to cut the wood. With the last of his strength, the man took a swing. and he felt as if something was holding his hands down. Gabriel grabbed the handle of his master's axe. Roy did not understand this gesture and was surprised. But when the servant took the axe out of his hands, he realized that he intended to help. Roy said that he needed boards measuring 2 to 1 heel, showing the approximate parameters with his palms. Gabriel confidently throws a few logs up. He makes a clear swing and aims with concentration. And with skillful movements, he chops the logs into smaller pieces in midair. Neat, finished boards of the right size fall to the ground. Roy stands in a stupor with his jaw open from the show he saw. He shows his appreciation for Gabriel. The man considers the servant to be a true sword master who does not need any modern devices. He approaches him with his hand on his shoulder. With a smile, he says that when he is done, he can help him with the digging. Gabriel is shocked that the owner doesn't thank him and makes him work. He had already forgotten about his character. Roy thought that he helped him out of interest. He would definitely cheat someone someday, but how? The man wanted to finish the job as soon as possible to see the result. To do this, they had to work together. Gabriel was embarrassed by his host's approach. But he thought that although Roy had changed in recent days, he still could not trust him. He could only test this by completing the construction together with his master. Sweat ran down Gabriel's forehead as he continued to dig diligently. Roy, though tired, kept up with his servant. The earth was flying out from under their shovels. And at one point Roy stopped, raising the shovel above his head. It was firmly embedded in the ground as his feet ran. Both men stood side by side and looked at the finished house. Roy confidently announced that the construction was complete. Gabriel asked what kind of hieroglyph was depicted on the roof of the house. He replied that it was the logo of his brand. Roy decided to arrange a check. How exactly he had deceived the innkeeper. The servant did not understand how this would happen. There was a dense forest nearby. From there, the man brought wood and lit a fire in a special hole in the house's foundation. Smoke came out of the chimney on the roof. The innkeeper and his mother enjoyed sitting on the warm floor. All the tendons in the old woman's body could finally rest. The innkeeper could not believe that this was possible. Roy was pleased, because the people of this world could only wonder. Because this power of floor heating is almost like magic. The innkeeper sincerely thanked the owner for the smile on his mother's face. Gabriel was dumbfounded that they were smiling just as Roy had said before. In one morning, he changed not only his behavior but also his work ethic. He also fulfilled the agreement. Was it all for the sake of seeing smiles on these people's faces? It was impossible. Roy is not that kind of person. But he saw the sincere, warm smiles of satisfied villagers. They were really happy. Roy received a message that Gabriel's interest level in him had increased by 2 points. Now it was -29. And because the relationship with him had improved, Roy received 36 points. The man was happy to read all this. He assumed that Gabriel's opinion of him had changed. In any case, the first order was fulfilled, despite the fact that he was in the red now. After all, he built this model home to advertise his services. A few days later, there was a line of city residents waiting outside the new building to try out the new development. Everyone left saying that they had almost melted. Roy was sitting at the table next to him, offering everyone to make such a room in his house. He offered 2 models to choose from, with the possibility of either completing one room or rebuilding the entire house, adding a discount. The peasant was confused because he did not trust Roy. The man decided to reiterate that they needed to trust each other. He also proved to the potential buyer that such a price was almost nothing. Suddenly, someone approached him. It was his father, Baron Frontera, who was interested in what his son was doing. The level of interest in Roy was -20. The man did not expect to see his father here. The estate of the Frontera family. In the middle of a large room at a long dining room table, Roy was having lunch with his father. The man looked at his father. He had been avoiding him so much, and now if he forbids his son to build, What will he do? The man's thoughts were interrupted by his father, who said he was ready to hear Royd out. The father wanted to know what he had come up with this time. Royd said that the innkeeper had given him an order to create floor heating, and he had fulfilled it. And now he makes contracts with other residents of the town. But for his father, the townspeople are very important and valuable, and he will not forgive deception against them. Royd assured his father not to worry, even though no one believed him. With that, the man decided to leave. My father assumed that he was doing this because of the financial situation in their family. After all, he has eyes and ears, and he must have already realized everything. The father assured his son that he shouldn't worry because he would solve the problem himself. At that moment, Royd remembered something. He had heard these words before. When his father had said that everything was fine, and that he shouldn't worry, that his main concern was his studies. Royd really thought that everything was fine. So he said it was a lie and nothing was wrong with them. He didn't want to be miserable because of someone's bad money. Royd supported his father, and said he would try his best too. A few years ago, he should have said those words to his father too. Walking down the corridor, Royd counted the number of orders and the deposit he had already received. And then he met two men in the corridor. They were two loan sharks. Their names were Methoff and Silo. The men passed by and did not even greet the Baron's son. Royd was interested in their behavior. They went into his father's room. The moneylenders expressed their dissatisfaction with the delay in payment of more than 5 days. They said that if they continued to delay payments, they would not sit idly by. Arcos was embarrassed. Silo suggested that if they sold the items in the house, the money would come. A swarm was watching through the doorway, just in time. The moneylenders appeared just in time. The swarm's RP was 36 points. He got a few points by improving his relationship with Gabriel, but he didn't know where to apply them. The messenger explained to the man that he could invest the points in talent and thus improve his skills. The messenger started downloading. A shining blue circle appeared under the man's feet. It began to reveal the man's knowledge of mechanics, soil hydrology, structural mechanics, water supply systems, and the design of steel and concrete structures. The messenger was surprised at how much the swarm knew. Based on his knowledge, he could improve some skills for 15 points each. The man did not quite understand what was going on here, but he would have plenty of RP, so he tried to improve his knowledge in 2 skills at once. First, he gained knowledge of basic topographic surveying. His eyes shone with green light. He did not understand what was happening. Opening the window, the man realized that even without using GPS, he could calculate everything himself using his own eyes. Then he acquired the skill of basic level design. It was a great help, because only recently he had been struggling to draw a project on a piece of paper. In the future, it will certainly be much easier for him, but will Gabriel's help alone be enough? If only he could get some heavy equipment. The messenger encouraged the man by telling him that he had something. Royd could not believe it. He was given a random choice of a phantom partner who would help him with everything. The man was skeptical. In order to start, he had to give 50 RP. The man was annoyed. He did not have enough points, and he had only 1 time left. Royd seriously thought about the phantom. After all, if this is what he thought, then their combined strength would be equal to that of heavy machinery. He needed to collect the RP. And to do this, the man had to get the main characters to be interested in him. The moneylender banged his palm on Baron Frontera's desk. He wanted to tell him a way to get the money if he didn't have a penny. He suggested selling his wife and children, for which he could get a lot of money. Arcos was furious at this suggestion. After all, even though he was a creditor, he still had to keep his decorum. Suddenly, a moneylender came into my father's room with a sack behind his back. The moneylender was surprised to see the man. However, when he found out who he was, the moneylender tried to hurt Frontera's son by pointing out his ill-mannered behavior. Royd boldly asked the men to show him their invitation letter first. The men did not understand what he was talking about. Royd supported his words with an article from the kingdom's basic law. It was about protecting the interests of the aristocracy. And in this situation, their visit without an invitation letter was defined as an invasion. The outraged men began to shout that he was talking nonsense and that no one had ever heard of such a law before. In order not to be unfounded, Royd suggested that we all check the law together. The man called for a servant. Gabriel went into the Baron's room. He was ready and had his hand on his sword. Royd angrily ordered him to cut off the invader's hand. The men were completely frightened, assuming that he had gone mad. Ross suggested that they check the existence of such a law. But whose side the court would take? Gabriel holstered his sword. The sick men were amazed and puzzled, but they had not expected such a turn of events. The frightened men left threatening problems for the swarm. They intended to make him regret his actions. The door slammed loudly. Royd was proud of his triumph. The father turned to his son and servant. He asked what was the meaning of what they had just done. After all, this was a situation where they had to be persuaded on their knees. Royd silently handed the sack to his father on the table. The man admitted that at first he wanted to get the entire deposit and give it to his father. However, this amount would be enough to pay off the interest this month. The father thought his son had collected the money from the townspeople. But Gabriel told him that the Baron shouldn't worry about it. After all, he would make sure that Royd fulfilled the terms of the contract. Looking at the servant, the father realized that Gabriel trusted the swarm completely. It was time for the men to leave. They walked along the corridor of the estate. Gabriel wanted to know how the swarm knew such laws, because in his opinion, he was short-sighted. He replied that he had heard it somewhere, and it was absolutely true. After all, Gabriel said it in the novel. After the Baron and his wife decided to pass away, then these two moneylenders wanted to get and sell their bodies. And it was then that Gabriel reminded them of an article from the basic law of the kingdom. Saying these words, he took their lives with his sword. And in court, he was fully acquitted. For Royd, knowing the content of the novel was a big plus. In any case, he was expecting a new message from the messenger. At that moment, he received a message that Baron Frontera's interest in him had increased by 6 points. Having improved his relationship with the main character, he received 60 points. Now his total number of points was 61. Everything went exactly as he had planned. The Phantom was already waiting for him. The full moon was shining brightly in the night sky. At dusk, Royd stood on the training ground preparing for something. Looking around, he made sure there was no one around. The messenger offered him a random drawing of a fantastic creature. One attempt was equal to 50 RP. The man began the process of random drawing. Suddenly, a green flash appeared next to him out of nowhere. Its particles formed into gears that rotated as a single mechanism. Expanding the space between each other, they created new elements. Royd watched this action with fascination as if it were magic. The green particles formed into some kind of spell. This small mechanism only made an unpleasant noise. And then a bright light began to emanate from the middle of the light circle. The light turned into the face of a small hamster-like creature. Royd was puzzled by what he saw. The little creature jumped to the ground at Royd's feet. The hamster looked happily at the man, its eyes sparkling. The creature was tiny compared to Frontera's height. The swarm called the creature some kind of nonsense. The hamster was extremely offended by this, and his eyes filled with tears. When Royd was about to leave, the rodent began to make indignant noises at the man. He asked what the hamster could do, and if he could demonstrate it. The hamster pointed to its cheeks with its paws and started chewing. Suddenly, he spat out a crumpled piece of paper. It turned out to be an instruction sheet for a litter box. It said that the litter box was a cute hamster that needed to be taken care of with love. Also, along with the instructions, there were colored sunflower seeds that could change its structure. The red seed made it possible for the pallet to grow giant for 12 hours. and the blue seed allowed the pallet to become small. It had to be given to the hamster before the effect of the red seed wore off. A set of 2 seeds cost 1 rupee. The man wanted to know if the hamster could grow to the size of a human. But since the hamster could not speak, he had to test it himself. He thought that if hamsters are good at digging, then if it became the size of a man, it would be a very useful helper. Royd gave the hamster a red seed. The hamster ate it in a flash. Before the man's eyes, the hamster began to grow in size. It was so big that it was resting on the swarm's face. Suddenly, the man flew several meters away from the powerful push. He could not believe what he was seeing. The hamster was at least 10 meters tall. He looked down on the swarm. A message came in about a padong skill, namely level 1 digging. The swarm only managed to shout the rodent's name as it began to dig rapidly. A message about another hamster skill, level 1 earth fortification. The hamster laid down on the ground and began to spin from place to place. Another skill, first level cheek puffing. The hamster stood there with its cheeks puffed out, looking at the swarm. And in a flash, he spat out a giant boulder right in front of the man. The boulder was bigger than the swarm. The man was amazed and satisfied at the same time. He had finally solved the problem with the heavy machinery. But if he appeared in public with this magical hamster, people would become suspicious. In the end, he decided that he would simply carry a book of callings and call himself a genius recruiter. And then, he would deal with the problem of workers for large-scale construction. White fluffy clouds floated across the sky. Another ordinary quiet day in the city. Royd stood on the beach with a team of workers and asked them to repeat after him. That safety was the most important thing. All the men were sleepy and unfocused. But what could you expect from the 30-man army of the Barony of Frontera? He couldn't help but laugh because they answered as if they were soldiers who were paid and didn't work. He wondered why they hadn't been dispersed yet, because the Baron had a lot of debts. That's why they wouldn't get any additional bonuses, because they already had labor. Royd addressed the soldiers to emphasize the importance of their unity and cohesion. After all, the purpose of the army is to accomplish tasks. When he was in the army, they did more digging and weeding than training. Royd then pointed to a pile of earth as an example of his fruitful work that night. Although, in fact, the entire pile was dug up in just half an hour. Their main task was to revive the estate. It was a project of a boiler house for the people of the estate. To build it, they had to move all the earth there. The workers were not motivated by the owner's words, and were afraid of the amount of work. Royd knew he should expect this reaction from them. Suddenly a man approached him. It was a senior knight of the Barony of Frontera named Newman. He wanted to clarify what the royalty had ordered his men to do. And also the royalty expected this man to speak. There are 3 knights in this estate. One of them is Newman. Byron and the protagonist of the novel, Xavier Azrahan, obey him. At the beginning of the novel, only Byron and Xavier remained loyal until the fall of the estate. This man was the first to betray and abandon the Baron. Since it was Newman who sold the information about the Baron to the intruder, we owe him a small debt. Royd thought it was not good that such a man was a senior knight. The man asked the newcomer what he thought they were doing. The knight could not believe that the Royd was forcing the army to do dirty work. After all, as a senior knight, he could not tolerate this. Royd called it nonsense because he earns money to cover his debts. And he had gotten the Baron's permission. Newman could not believe how he had deceived his lord and decided to recall the young master's past. The knight believed that he was using the army for personal gain. Royd closed his eyes at this statement from the knight. But after a moment, he smiled and agreed that he was right. He would get it now. After all, it was enough to look at his weak endurance. If he tried to play an online game, he would have failed in a minute. Royd picked up a shovel from the ground. The man swung the shovel toward the Newman. The workers were shocked by his action. Newman could barely shield himself from the clods of earth that flew at his face. The smile on the swarm's face was unwavering. The clods of earth fell on the knight's shoes. Newman was furious. He called the man a scoundrel who tried to spoil the knight's reputation. He considered him a foolish son of an almost bankrupt baron. Royd thought that the knight wanted to throw away his regalia and pick a fight with him. The man picked up a shovel and began to twirl it in his hands. Instantly, he got into a fighting stance and aimed the end of the shovel at the Newman, saying that he was not against a duel. In return, the knight said that he would regret it. A month later, he and the knight gathered for a duel. Gabriel asked his host if he was really sure of his victory. Royd, sitting on his bed, replied that of course not. After all, his opponent is a knight called the Heart of Manhwa and a junior sword expert. And he is just a lazy man who is not able to resist him. In his opinion, this question was not thoughtful on Gabriel's part. The servant could barely keep his hand away from the sword to avoid fighting back. He could not believe that Royd suddenly threw the ground in the face of Knight Newman, and even asked for a duel. He probably wants to be a scoundrel again. But it was he who came up with the idea of making money this way, and asked the Baron for a favor. And then he got into an argument and eliminated him. By this time, he had appointed the knight Baron as a temporary manager, and was in charge of a team of workers. But despite this, Gabriel still did not believe that Royd was unsure about the duel. The servant could barely restrain himself from hurting his master. Royd interrupted Gabriel's inner thoughts by asking him for a favor. He wanted him to teach him how to use a sword. But the servant refused outright. First of all, his main task was to protect the young Master Royd. Secondly, he compared the man to a sack, meaning that if the sack learned a sword, it would be more dangerous for everyone else to be around him. Royd was upset that Gabriel did not want to teach him. So in exchange for fencing lessons, Royd offered to help the servant with his insomnia. Gabriel was shocked to learn how he knew about it. Royd knew about it from the novel, and also about what caused the insomnia. In the novel The Knight of Steel, all knights are divided into 4 ranks. The least expert, the middle, the highest, and the master of the sword. Currently, Gabriel's level is the highest sword expert, and he will soon become a sword master. The reason for his insomnia is his inhuman nerves, which are too sensitive. This is the so-called sword master syndrome. But of course, in the countryside they don't know about such things, including Gabriel. So Royd offered his deal to the servant, because he could see on his face that he was not sleeping well. The servant sighed heavily, and agreed to teach young Frontera. The master asked him not to give in to him. It is clear that Gabriel agreed to this deal because he was sure that his master would lose. After all, he had already tried many things to cure insomnia, starting with cognitive behavioral treatment and ending with aromatherapy. In a moment, Gabriel fell asleep with a pillow in his hands, sitting in his chair. After all, Royd had proven that he knew how to cure his insomnia. It was the first time he had accidentally fallen asleep while studying magic techniques. The 18th magic technique is to read out instructions for iron and concrete structures. That's what really puts you to sleep. Now Royd will master all the fencing skills that Gabriel has. The weather was sunny and warm. Gabriel ordered his master to run 50 laps right now. Royd was stunned. But he obediently turned around and started running. He ran without even complaining. The servant watched the young Frontera's marathon closely. It was not easy, but the boy showed good promise. When he reached the finish line, the tired man asked the servant to teach him something better. After that, he started the second lap of the race. He ran up to the servant again to find out that he doubted that Royd could do it. The third lap was much easier for the man than the second. Most likely, if Royd had started to whine, the servant would have said that he could not do it and turned away from him. Gabriel gritted his teeth and agreed with this assumption. Royd intended to run to the end and find out what Gabriel would do then. A message appeared about the passive skill freakishness as it had risen to level 4. Everyone who saw him thought he was crazy and wanted to hit him. But the swarm denied having this skill. Dust flew from under his feet. In fact, he was very tired, and it would be a lie to say he wasn't. But this was nothing compared to his life in Korea. He had no family to give him warmth. Every morning he opened his eyes to a crowded Gashawon. Every day he carried bricks to the 4th floor of the villa. Every night he loaded trucks with boxes. And all this just to keep from starving to death. Constantly dreaming that someday it would be better. Every time he replayed these words in his head. "Hang in there, Kim Soo Ho, it will get better, you're doing well, just a little bit longer." Kim seemed to be reaching for the cherished star. He froze, waiting for it to end a little more. After all, the star was still so far away. And then it completely disappeared from his sight. Kim Soo Ho was in deep despair and despondency. So compared to that pain and despair, this was nothing. Roy continued to run in a circle. Seeing all this, Gabriel said that he would teach him fencing for his sincerity with him. A note appeared in the messenger because Gabriel's opinion of him had improved by +1 point. But his overall opinion of him was now -28. He also received 18 points for a slight improvement in his relationship with a key character. The total score was 29 points. It was getting dark in the city, and the moon was shining its light through the windows of the Fronter's mansion. Newman was talking to Arcos, expressing his indignation at the actions of his son Royd. His father believed that he had come to his senses these days, although he probably misunderstood him. His moral duty required him not to interfere in the duel. And besides, Royd was to become the heir, so the father asked the knight not to be hard on his son. Arcus asked that he be brought to consciousness, so that he would not be mutilated. Newman accepted the Baron's request. But he doubted whether he could do it during the duel. He intended to end this scoundrel once and for all. And if the Baron began to blow it out of proportion, he would have him and his wife killed by making the crime look like suicide. And then, as planned, he will leave this city to seek a better life. Now, thanks to the young scoundrel, his plan will come true faster than he expected. A month has passed since Newman's last conversation with his father. A dueling arena has been set up on the grounds where Royd trained, with opponents already standing. Sitting at the judge's table, Royd's parents, as well as Gabriel and Byron, were to watch the action. Holding out his sword, Newman asked Royd if he was ready. The young frontier stood with a shovel in his hands. Throwing it upside down, the man slung it over his shoulders and confidently announced his readiness. The man smiled and ordered the knight to get ready to receive the full measure. The audience was shocked that the swarm would fight Knight Newman with this. The knight's eyes were filled with indescribable anger and malice. Gabriel explained that the shovel was made of metal he had ordered from a blacksmith. The father was ashamed of his son because he took it as a joke. Gabriel didn't think it was a joke because he remembered what the owner had been doing for the last month. He did general exercises early in the morning and did not complain. Then he went to the construction site to explain the instructions for the boiler room to the village engineers. And then he practiced with his sword as long as his legs kept him moving. This was not the will of a man who was just joking. The servant was sure that Royd was completely serious in his intentions. And then Arcos began to announce to everyone that the duel between Frontera's swarm and the knight Newman was starting right now. The knight took a defensive stance with his sword pointed at his opponent. The swarm held a shovel in his hands and smiled slyly at his opponent. Gabriel noticed his host's foolish stance. Immediately Newman swung his sword at the man, believing that he was mocking him. Royd was calmly and confidently waiting for the right moment. A moment before the blow, he managed to jump aside. Arcos and his servant were genuinely surprised by this reaction. However, Newman did not give up and made a second attempt to assassinate him. But the swarm skillfully deflected this blow as well. It was an incredible and effective technique. This is a special technique that was used in real battles. It was as if his sword skills had instantly improved after all these years. Newman stopped in surprise. Although Royd did not see anything strange in this, because in Korea every man can do it. It was a modern hand-to-hand combat technique, a bayonet attack. And then the roller strikes the opponent a strong blow, which literally knocks him down. After all, this shovel is capable of anything. He can even use it as a shield to protect himself from sharp blows. Another blow to the Newman's side, but it missed the target. Then Royd decided to do something else. He put his feet on the shovel, and now he could jump on it. The knight was puzzled by this behavior of his opponent. Gabriel thought that he was really joking. But the swarm was determined. Perhaps he was not joking after all. Newman rushed into the fight. The first weapon that Royd prepared to deal with Newman was a shovel. The second was the basics of fencing that Gabriel had taught him. The knight could not understand how the front became so strong. After all, he was a drunk and a lazy man. And the third thing that Royd used was the synchronized ability to control the tool. He had the first level of digging. The man had to become one with the shovel in body and soul. The level of synchronization between them would increase. Gabriel's opinion of him increased by +1 point during the training. The defense and the baronesses who saw their son sincere for the first time in his life, it increased by +2 and +3 points. And during all this time, he accumulated 97 points. The messenger suggested that he learn an additional digging skill worth 40 RP. Royd mastered a pretty cool skill, so he didn't think about giving up. Steam came out of the Newman's nose. He had no choice, so he realized that it was time to use something that could not be used against an ordinary person. A blue magical glow began to appear around the man. Gabriel suspected something was wrong. The Newman's body was filled with magical energy that was concentrated in his chest. When he saw this roll, he realized that the knight was being pumped with mana. This is the heart made of mana. Newman completed the pumping and took the sword in his hands. Now everything was serious. Royd silently waited for what would happen next. The knight was furious. Sparks flew from his eyes. He made a powerful swing at Royd. Gabriel knew that it took at least 5 years to develop a mana heart. Therefore, he believed that the young master would not be able to block such an attack. The knight's sword almost touched Frontera's body. The parents screamed in fright to the knight. Freud was worried, but did not give up. Newman was eager to finish off the young Frontera right now. The mother and father of the swarm froze in anticipation of horror. But their son, along with his shovel, was able to withstand such an incredibly powerful attack. Newman did not even have time to understand how the opponent was able to resist him. He felt as if all the strength he had inside was leaving him. This was the fourth skill that Royd had prepared for him. It was the mana that made Gabriel Xavier the strongest character in the novel. It was the Azrahan core technique. Through a connected sword and shovel, the Royd was able to take all the mana into his body. The knight could not believe that his mana was drained. Frontera concentrated as never before, and made a powerful swing with the shovel. It entered the knight's face like butter. A snow-white tooth flew into the sky. Before Newman could recover from the blow, another one flew out of his mouth. It was his tooth. Royd dealt another epic blow to the knight with the handle of the shovel. And then, raising it high above his head, he threw a humiliating look at his opponent, who could no longer resist. Newman was completely frightened by the man's skills. Finally, the powerless knight fell face first to the ground. All the spectators were shocked by this outcome. Arcos and Gabriel looked at their swarm with pride. Everyone thought it was crazy, and no one could believe that the young master of the swarm had defeated the Newman. The Baron made an announcement that Frontera's swarm had won the duel. Lying on the ground, Newman thought about how this scoundrel could defeat such a master swordsman as he was. Royd approached the knight to emphasize once again that he had defeated him. Let's just say he was shaken up. Suddenly, the man raised his shovel to give the knight one last good punishment. The toothless knight froze lying on the ground, waiting for Frontera's actions. The father turned to his son to understand what he was doing, since the duel was already over. But the young master did not care, because the time of reckoning had come. The father turned to his son with horror on his face to stop him. The guards ran up to the swarm and pulled him away from the knight, asking him to stop. Byron thought he had gone mad. Gabriel also assumed so. Royd calmed down and asked the guards to let him go. Newman covered his head with his hands and lay motionless on the ground. Finally, the guards and the owner stood calmly next to the knight. But a moment later, the swarm broke loose and began to beat his opponent on the back. The guards tried to stop him, but their efforts were in vain. Gabriel thought that if he looked closely, he could see that he was beating him so as not to hurt him too badly. At the same time, his face was completely calm, as if he knew in advance what would happen next, and as if he already knew everything that would happen. 15 days before the duel, Royd asked his servant to teach him the aristocrat mind technique. Gabriel was surprised by this request, but Royd saw nothing wrong with it. After all, in addition to assimilating magma, it can attract mana from the things around him and turn it into his mana. The servant was seriously puzzled as to how the master knew this. This was a technique he had always kept secret, and it had not even been finalized yet. Royd refuted this by saying that Gabriel himself had talked about it on the day the master helped him to sleep. The servant didn't understand how he could know about a technique that didn't exist. Gabriel refused to teach him the technique. However, Royd said that he would help him complete it after he had learned it. Seeing the overconfidence of the sword master, his servant agreed to see if it was possible. Royd stuck his sword in the ground. The man suggested that perhaps his mana heart was sucking in mana from the outside by itself, and as a result, it bounced off. The young frontiersman realized that from the point of view of his heart, the external mana was something foreign. But if the source is changed, the mana he absorbs from the outside will not mix with the heart of mana. So it needs to be allowed to connect separately. It has to be rolled up and used. He compared it to an auxiliary engine that was near the main engine. After all, they make up one whole, but at the same time work separately. Isn't it cool? Gabriel was sure it was possible, even though he had no idea what an engine was. Royd was excited because he had just imagined it, and it seemed to work. The look on his master's face told Gabriel that he clearly knew something. That's how he managed to complete the aristocrat mind technique that had been bothering the servant for a long time. Since his first attempt, the number of contours he could create had increased to 3. If he continues to practice, he will be able to reach 4 or even 5 contours. There was a report that Gabriel Savier's opinion of him had increased by +5. These words worried Royd, because he wanted to master only the part about sucking up the mana he touched. Gabriel had expected him to defeat the Knight of the Newman, since the young master of the swarm had this ability. But his victory was triumphant. Standing up, his father shouted at the swarm to stop and not to spoil the knight's reputation. The man stopped and was embarrassed. He was surprised by the words about the knight's reputation. To question his father's words, he asked him to look under the tablecloth on the table where he was sitting. Arcos lifted the tablecloth and saw a pile of envelopes with letters. The stunned father began to study their contents. Royd explained that these letters were from Tords, the scoundrel who had been damaging the Baron's estate all along, and they were sent by this knight Newman. There he told about the events in the estate, what the Baron liked and disliked, and how to forge property documents. These letters contained everything they had managed to share. Newman was shocked by this because he had kept his letters safely hidden inside the walls. Later in the novel, Xavier would find them anyway. And last night, Royd sent a peddler to fetch them, who promptly fulfilled his errand. Arcus was stunned by what he saw and heard. As expected in the novel, he was described as a good man. There would be a great uproar if they did away with him now. The Baron felt sorry for him, but the words good leader and good leader mean very different things. Royd offered his help in getting rid of the man. He thought a good punishment would be to have an angry rat put on the knight's head. And then he would be chased out of the manor, mutilated by rats. Or he could be reduced to the level of an ordinary soldier and given the opportunity to correct his actions. People were outraged by this proposal, saying that this could not be done. Arcas decided that this was really too harsh a punishment for such an act, so he would be given a chance to reform, but it would be the last warning. Byron also agreed with this wise decision. And a good warning for other people, too. Everyone agreed with the Baron's decision. Royd asked Newman if he had any objections to this. He replied that he did not, and thanked him for his mercy. The young Frontera was touched by the words of mercy. After all, if everyone treats criminals well, will they correct their mistakes for the sake of the forgiveness they have been given? It is unlikely. Rather, they will become more confident and try to take advantage of the kindness and mercy given to them. Newman believed that Baron Frontera would regret his decision, because he would definitely take revenge on him and his son. Royd noticed that the knight smiled and said that this smile would be his last. Newman did not understand what the bastard was getting at. The young frontline soldier took out his little pocket hamster, Podong, and happily handed him a red seed. After he swallowed it, Royd threw the furry high into the sky with a cold expression on his face. After all, there is no better way to apologize than that. In flight, the hamster quickly broke the seed shell and ate the seed inside. After the snack, the rodent began to grow in size before our eyes, getting bigger and bigger every second. The man's parents opened their jaws at what they saw. Gabriel, along with Byron, also watched with bated breath. All the spectators and residents of the town were puzzled, surprised, and a little scared. As the giant furry beast approached the ground, the swarm ran for cover, while Newman just sat there. In surprise, he opened his mouth and one eye, because the other was damaged in the duel. The hamster flew at breakneck speed to the knight, who just realized that he should run away as fast as possible. But it was too late. The hamster fell loudly right on the ground where Newman was sitting. The impact created a big dust cloud. The ground around the hamster was covered with cracks and crevices everywhere. Royd felt sorry for the knight, but he ordered him to drive it away. This would solve the problem with the callous person who lived inside the manor forever. It was a sunny, warm day in the city. The giant hamster was busy with important work. His paws diligently and quickly dug up the ground. He dug a canal through the whole street in the city. Gabriel asked the swarm what the Podong was doing now, and he replied that his rodent was preparing to widen the road. Meanwhile, the humble laborers suddenly turned into master craftsmen. Once upon a time, there was a city called Rome. Its inhabitants were very fond of roads. They built a special road system called the Appian Way. This is what they will have to do now. Ruidma intended to start from the Baron's house and end at the eastern hill. Gabriel was surprised by the need to build a road in their town. The owner assured him that he would soon see for himself, as their town would become very popular with visitors. The servant asked where he had learned all this. He wanted to know how he came up with the idea to build a heating system that no one had ever heard of before. He also wanted to know how he had suddenly learned to call on beings from the outside. Gabriel said that it all sounded like magic of the highest level. He also cautiously asked if he was really their true master, the swarm. Frontera received a message of danger because Xavier began to doubt him. The man suddenly began to sweat, and Gabriel perked up his ears, waiting for a logical explanation for his dramatic change. Even when Kim Soo Ho had read about this guard in the novel, he knew that he was quite capable. He could easily guess if there was a stranger in the body of the Baron's son. Then he would definitely end him. After all, this guy is no fun to mess with. But he didn't have to worry about that because he had a special skill for such cases. Royd trained in secret from everyone. His special skill was perseverance. Gabriel believed that his young master used to drink for days on end in secret. But Royd refuted this by saying that the servant was not with him 24 hours a day. Perhaps he had been a real fool and a party animal before. But Gabriel knew nothing about what he had been doing all this time. But how could the master explain his new magic skills? Because even mages with great experience sometimes fail to do this. In his defense, The Royd decided to ask the servant himself how he could handle mana so easily, even though he was barely in his 20s. Perhaps someone had taught him this too. Gabriel did not consider himself a brilliant magician, but Royd tried to convince him otherwise. This dialogue made the servant think seriously. The young front man, using his special skills of quick conversation and persistence, was able to quickly end the conversation and go about his business alone. Royd began to worry about the rapid conversation with the servant. The man approached the Baron Knight and asked him to monitor the progress of the work while he was away. The knight agreed and assured him that he would take care of everything. Gabriel said he would go with him because it was his duty to protect his master. Royd did not object, and at that moment the men set off. They were heading to a place on the trail of an unpaid debt, to the small town of the Redhead's estate. The men saw a wooden sign with the inscription Hotel. Suddenly, a man slammed his fist on the table and started swearing. It was the house of the intruder, Rhodes. He was swearing in his house because he couldn't believe he had lost all his money. He had to make those bastards pay. Another man in a black robe approached him and asked if that was the point of all gambling. After all, that's what he was making money on. Realizing that the man could not pay for his services, he said he was leaving him right now. But the man immediately said that he would pay him, and even more than he had if he stayed with him. The problem was that Rhodes could only make money by deceiving other people. But now there are too many people who want to get even with him. So now the man had to lay low. Hearing these words, Royd thought it was about him, and immediately opened the door with his foot. Rhodes and his partner were stunned by the visit. It was not surprising for the swarm, because they had never seen each other in person before. So he introduced himself so that everyone could understand. Rhodes and his partner's faces showed incredible shock and fear. In a moment, the attacker ordered the other man to run away together. The big man in the black robe picked up the attacker in his arms. And at the same moment, the two of them flew out of the window of the Rhodes house. The man landed in the center of the city holding his boss in his arms. He furrowed his brow to keep himself alert. Opposite him stood Gabriel, sword in hand. The man immediately made a spectacular swing of his sword to frighten the big man. He ordered him to give the Rhodes to them, and in this case they would not harm him. Everything happened as the young owner of the Rhodes said it would. They tried to escape through the window, so the front man ordered the servant to wait here. The big man in the black robe was quite outraged by this, and asked if he knew how to use a sword. His eyes turned white, and a black and red blob of magic spun in his hands. After the Baron's death, Xavier only wanted revenge. He fought a duel with a personal bodyguard of Rhodes, the criminal on whose trail he had managed to get. It was also his first battle with a dark wizard. It was not easy for Xavier, but he had to resist the magic of gravity. This is how it was in the novel. Meanwhile, the man in the cloak was launching magic bullets at Gabriel one by one. But thanks to his supreme skill, the man skillfully deflected his opponent's attacks. His dark magic broke up into tiny particles that flew in different directions. Gabriel stood confidently on the battlefield, looking the wizard in the eye. As planned, he had to die. His fist flew into the face of his opponent. But at that moment, the servant was able to stand on his feet. In the novel, Xavier fought the bastard as a mere weapons specialist. When the magician looked at him, he was very surprised. He saw his heart of mana and turned pale. After all, a real Xavier has a heart of mana with a triple ring around it. With new strength, Gabriel took a swing with his sword. He noticed something. Did he have the magic that controlled gravity? Mom had no choice but to point her fist in Gabriel's direction. But in a moment, he was in the air, even though they hadn't agreed on that. Rhodes only had time to reach out to his assistant to stop him, but he was faster. Gabriel turned to Rhodes and asked him if he knew what happens when someone cheats honest people. The criminal was very scared and could not say anything in response. The servant drove the criminal into a dead end, and unable to run, The man fell down and hit the barrels. Gabriel wanted to leave him without legs, so that he could only crawl to court on all fours. Rhodes tried to cover his face with his hand. Gabriel took a swing at the criminal, and at the same moment Rhodes ordered him to stop. The man blocked the criminal with his body, facing the servant. The young frontier man justified his action by saying that Gabriel was not going to act wisely. After all, if he had gone to court without his legs, he would have been punished. At that moment, Gabriel realized that he had almost committed the same crime as this bastard. Would his master now also show compassion for others?